Welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's presentation. My name is Karen Hale, and I am the Senior Program Coordinator at the Collaborative Center for Community Engaged Learning and Research, which is part of the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, or DICE. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you here this evening. I want to thank you for joining us for this special presentation on critical mentoring, a topic that's even more important during these changing and trying times, especially for underserved youth. This event is being recorded, and by staying in this session, you are agreeing to be recorded. So at this time, I would like to invite the Associate Vice Chancellor for Educational Equity in the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, Dr. Tiffany Butler, to bring open our session on behalf of Rutgers University. Dr. Butler.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and you took my first couple of lines was just to introduce myself. So good evening, everyone. It's so exciting. I'm so excited to see all of you here tonight. Sometimes I would say when I was a kid back in church, we would say, it's nice to see your face in the place. And so I say that I'll say that to you tonight. My name is Dr. Tiffany Butler. I'm the Associate Vice Chancellor for Educational Equity in the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement, or DICE, as we affectionately call it. My pronouns are she, her, hers. And so welcome to Access Week 2022. Today is our second day of Access Week, and the aim of Access Week is to create campus awareness of the need for an equity mindset to help all students thrive in service of unlocking pathways to success. And so this year's theme is Enacting Beloved Community, and we believe that we achieve this by serving students holistically, supporting underserved students from a wide range of experiences and backgrounds to drive student success. And so our Access event for this evening is Critical Mentoring with Dr. Torie Weiston-Serdan, who will offer a critical framework to engage in culturally sustaining mentoring practices for those who are working with youth. And so the program will feature how to uplift up marginalized and minoritized students and center their voices to make them collaborative partners in their mentoring relationships. So on behalf of the entire DICE division, our Senior Vice President for Equity, Dr. Anna Branch, and the Educational Equity Group, welcome to Access Week 2022. And so as we come into community and begin to engage in some of this work together, we like to do a community acknowledgement. And so it's just naming and giving an acknowledgement of the current time, place, and space that we're in as a community, right? So as we enter in as whole people, we're saying that we recognize that current events may be affecting people in different ways. So the social issues, the political climate, the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic distractions, projects, deadlines, and all of those things may be impacting us in different ways as we come into this space. But we thank you so much for being in community with us today.
Okay, thank you so much, Dr. Butler. I just want to give you a little info for tonight's session, the format. We are going to have a talk with Dr. Torie Weiston-Serdan, followed by an intergenerational discussion with our student mentors. And then we will follow that with your questions that you can submit at any time in the chat.
And so before we move on to the very next thing, I just wanted to give the land acknowledgement. And so again, even as we enter into community and we begin to engage in this work today, we just want to give recognition to the Lenape people who we're working on their indigenous ancestral homeland. And so want to give credit where credit is due as we engage in this work today. So thank you so much for your time and attention. And again, I turn it back over to you, Karen.
So now it is my pleasure to introduce our special guest, Dr. Torie Weiston-Serdan. She is the Clinical Assistant Professor and Director in Community Engaged Education and Social Change at Claremont University. She has 15 years of teaching and youth programming experience. She's an emerging leader in the youth mentoring field. She did write the book, Critical Mentoring, a practical guide, which has become a handbook for culturally sustaining youth work in the discipline. Outside of teaching and research, Dr. Weiston-Serdan runs the Youth Mentoring Action Network, which is a nonprofit dedicated to leveraging justice and equity mentoring. Everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Weiston-Serdan. I leave it to you.
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to be in this space with you all. Thank you for the warm welcome. Thank you for pairing me up with some dope young people. I'm super excited to be in conversation with them. And I'm really excited to be talking to you all about critical mentoring today. You know, part of what I do all the time is really talk about critical mentoring, but it's really special for me, A, when I can do it alongside young folks, and B, when I can do it in higher ed institutions where I feel like there's a real responsibility for folks to step up to the game plate in this way, especially as it relates to showing up for young people and doing the work that young people deserve. One of the things that I always talk about is just my own experience as an educator, how I came to critical mentoring, because that helps me tell the story of what critical mentoring is. I was a high school English teacher for over 15 years. And really in my first year of teaching, I immediately recognized that there was going to be an issue with doing the work that I thought was really the most meaningful for young people within the auspices of the classroom context. You know, even just, we could talk about education as a whole separate issue, but being in the public high school classroom, I just recognized immediately there's 40 young people, there's one of me, I have them for 58 minutes at a time, they're gonna go off to another class. And I was really looking for some sort of meaningful way to engage young folks. And I was thinking really about what mentoring meant within the auspices of classroom context, but also in community. And I was also really thinking about how to build relationships. And I love that you all talked about what it means to be in community. And when I think about mentoring, I think very much, I really feel that mentoring is about building community, being in community with young folks and being a resource and a support for young folks. And I also tell the story about sort of my first experience of sort of doing mentoring. I like to tell folks that because I was a high school English teacher and I sort of saw these deficits and I saw that there was a lack of connection that was happening in the high school classroom, I turned to mentoring for sort of this other option. But as I was studying mentoring, I was still doing things that didn't quite line up to this idea or live up to this promise, I think, in terms of what young people deserved in relationship to mentoring. And so what I did was I studied all the best practice guides. I looked at all the research. I looked at all of what folks said was the right way to set up a mentoring program. And I did that. And then I proceeded for a year to do mentoring to young people. And I'm very intentional in expressing that I did mentoring to young people for a full year. It was not done alongside them or in collaboration with them. It was done to them because I didn't have their voice in this process. But the one thing that I did that actually sort of made sort of reestablished me or really helped me to get on the right track was at the end of doing mentoring to young people. So we set up the program for a year, we did it. And at the end of the year, we asked them, talk to us about this process, give us some feedback. And really that was the best thing that I ever did, was to listen to what young people had to say. And really that initial conversation, young folks giving me that feedback and young folks being in community with me and being willing to teach me about what they need is really how critical mentoring came to be. And a few things that they said, first and foremost, which I've already noted, was that we don't see this as mentoring, right? So yes, you paired us with adults. We did some tutoring. We had some great conversations. Adults checked on us, so to speak, right? But we weren't centered in this process. That was one of the first things they said, was that no one asked us what we wanted. No one asked us what mentoring looked like. You just did it, right? And you did it sort of without our voice at the table. And I was thankful for this piece of advice, but it also helped me to think about the more reciprocal process that mentoring needed to be in order for it to be more effective. The other thing they said to me was that, you know, really the mentoring process ended up being very academic. You know, obviously I was a high school English teacher. I was college educated. So a lot of my ideas about mentoring were very much rooted in my privilege, rooted in my middle classness. And all of those ideas sort of came to bear in the mentoring program that I brought together. And young folks said, you know, we get a lot of adults telling us sort of all the time to do well in school, to go off to college, you know, to be to be real academic, but we don't get a lot of opportunities to engage with adults on other issues that matter to us. We don't get a lot of opportunities to talk to adults about what career paths we really want to go down, right? What types of things that we want to explore in terms of what makes us happy in life. And so they were really kind of steering me away from this idea that mentoring was explicitly about academic outcomes, right? So that was another thing that they checked me on. The other thing is they said, while you are encouraging us to do well in school and to perform well academically, you're also not talking to us a lot about what that means for us in relationships to our identity, right? And of course, they're not saying things this way. I'm sort of summarizing, but we got into this conversation about, one young person, for example, told me, you've been kind of like on my case about, doing well in my math class, but I had expressed to you during the course of the year that I wasn't feeling good about what was happening in my math class, that my teacher doesn't like me, they weren't calling on me. She and the young persons were like, she was hating on me, right? So some of that language. And a lot of the feedback that I was giving to young people was sort of the typical answers really rooted in my adultism, right? It was like, oh, you're not going to get along with everyone, you're not going to like everyone, but technically, she's the boss, you have to do what she says, etc. And so I was really dismissing his ideas and his feelings about his own safety and how he was feeling in that classroom. And I was basically focusing on the fact that he needed to adjust, that he needed to change, right? So some of these core concepts came out like really early on in my exploration as a mentor, and it was young people that really taught me these lessons. And I started to think about what they said and started to process, and really what it meant was that I should not be doing mentoring to young people at all, right? I should be centering young people in the mentoring experiences, that in fact, young people really should have control over their own mentoring experiences. We like to say at the Youth Mentoring Action Network that young people deserve to have voice, power, and choice, right? That they should be partners and collaborators. We should be working alongside one another as we engage in this mentoring process that we call a relationship or a community, so to speak. The other thing was I needed to really start thinking outside of the academic sort of auspices, right? That mentoring in itself isn't, especially as it relates to BIPOC youth, should not just be centered on academic success or academic thriving. That in fact, a lot of what I thought was encouraging young people to be more academic or more rooted in academe was actually really stripping them of some key components of their identity and not really acknowledging ways that they were already thriving, right? Ways that they were already really doing good work. And it really just also assumed that every young person that I was working with wanted to go into sort of a formal higher education. But the last thing and the most important thing was that I was not considering the context of these young folks, right? I was not considering their identities. I was not considering the ways in which their identities had been marginalized, not only in schools, but also in society writ large. And so as I was sort of doing mentoring to them, I was also telling them that they needed to be the ones to change, that they needed to be the ones to fix themselves. I was not considering all the ways in which they were being harmed as a result of their identity. I was not considering all of the ways that they were being harmed or that violence was being done to them within institutions that were sort of trying to force them to navigate in a certain way or be in a certain way or show up, in a certain way. And so those critical mentoring lessons, really, that young people taught me early on is what came to be critical mentoring as folks know it today. It was thinking about how could I shift my role and my responsibility as mentor to be more considerate about the identity of the folks that I say that I'm mentoring, right? How could I be more intentional about curating spaces where young people who I call my proteges feel safe, feel secure, feel loved, feel affirmed, right? How do we explicitly talk about identity? How do we explicitly have conversations about race, class, sexuality, gender, right? All of these things that we were all navigating, but no one was talking about because we felt a lot safer just talking about how well they were doing in school, if their grades were getting better, the last test scores that they had, right? And I started thinking about mentoring being a little bit bigger of a responsibility in terms of ultimately making change, right? And attaching myself and really some of the young people I work with to larger movements that meant we were working together in collaboration to make greater change. And it also just really made me think about how I show up, right? How I show up as an elder. You know, one of the things that young people taught me very early on was just about how we often dismiss them and their ideas and their lived experiences, right? And how we sort of bypass that and sort of ignore context to say, you need to fix yourself. And I use the example of respectability politics to really illustrate this point. So many mentoring programs at the heart of their programming have respectability politics baked in within their programs, right? Let's learn how to tie a tie. Let's have a professional dress day. Let's focus on, how to get these young folks to pull their pants up or look more respectable. And I think that certainly when we're working with young people, we need to have very intentional conversations around professionalism, et cetera. And even what that means, I think unpacking some of what professionalism actually means is a really important question to have, or a really important discussion to have too. But I think really every time that we did that, we were saying to them that by fixing them, by changing them, that it would somehow magically fix all of the context that was steeped in white supremacy, right? That was steeped in racism, that was steeped in all the sort of sexism, right? And all of these different issues, that it would somehow fix that. And it was a misnomer, right? And it was a miseducation too, on some level, that I was saying to young folks, look, if you just take that hoodie off, you'll be more accepted. Like your math teacher you will stop experiencing microaggressions in your math class if you remove your hoodie, right? Which we know isn't correct. So young folks really just taught me to think more intentionally about the kind of guidance and the kind of wisdom that I was sharing and what it meant to be a mentor and what it meant to be a partner to young folks. And more importantly, a co-conspirator to young folks, right? And at the time that young people were teaching me all of this, I was also reading a lot of critical race theory work, and specifically critical race theory in education. I was reading Gloria Ladson-Billings, the OG, and some other folks. And I was really thinking about the conversations that they were having about race, right, and gender and sexuality, et cetera, ability, et cetera, within education, critical race theory in education. And I was thinking about how the nonprofit industry, primarily because a lot of those folks are the ones doing sort of community-based mentoring, was missing out on that conversation. And so between the research on critical race theory and the research on mentoring and some of those key components, I sort of figured out how to apply critical race theory to mentoring. And that's where critical mentoring ultimately came from in terms of the theoretical or the research side. But I always tell the story of how really young people brought me on this journey of how to best be a support for them, how to show up as an elder for them. And I think about this iteration, like this current space that we are in now, where we are asking young people to not only exist, but we're sort of really forcing them to be in the midst of a global pandemic, right? We're forcing them to go to school, to work, and to do all of the things that are challenging, that are really challenging in this moment, without fully taking into consideration what it means to be living through a pandemic. How many folks they've lost, how the pandemic has shifted what's happening economically within their household, right? How it's shifted what's happening in terms of generational connections in their household, right? We're asking them to show up to school, to benefit our ADA, to benefit capitalism, ultimately. We've asked them to have to show up for us in the midst of Freedom Summer, to fight on behalf of racial equity, because adults couldn't figure out how to get it done generations before, right? And it's not to discredit the folks who have come before us, and it's not to disrespect the folks that have come before us and the progress that we have made. But we also just need to acknowledge the reality that young people are inheriting, and that in this moment, we're asking them to do more and more and more. And a lot of it is because generationally, we have not been able to solve the problems that we say that we are so sort of eager to work on. And so when I think about critical mentoring and I think about its promise, I really think about, again, going back to this idea that adults need to show up, that elders need to show up in a way that makes sense for young people of today, that we need to consider what's happening in these white supremacist institutions. And we don't just need to help young people navigate the white supremacist institutions so that they can make it out on the other side. We need to begin to disrupt. We need to begin to dismantle. We need to begin to abolish. We need to, most importantly, dream and imagine what's possible on the other side. One of the reasons why I absolutely love working with young people is that young people still have this radical imagination that life on some level has beaten out of the rest of us who are elders. And I don't mean to make that sound so negative, but I'm just trying to keep it, 100% in here, is that this idea that we've all sort of adjusted or adapted to the toxicity that's around us, so much so that we don't even know, right? Like we have just become our trauma, and our trauma has become us. Like we don't even recognize this at some point. We're so busy sort of surviving. And one of the things that inspires me about young people is they still have this radical imagination, and that they question and they challenge and they say, well, why is it like this? And why does it have to be like this? And one of the things I notice in terms of the dynamics between sort of adults and young people is that I hear adults say all the time to young people, well, it's just always been this way. We've always done it this way. We're not going to change that policy because that policy has been in effect since whatever year you want to note, right? And what I hear young people challenging us to do, is to move away from that idea that just because things are like that or have been like that, that they have to continue to be that way. What young people do is young people inspire me to rethink, to reimagine, to change, right? They push my boundaries, they question, they challenge, right? They say, just because you lived through that harm doesn't mean that I should have to live through that harm. Just because you lived through that trauma does not mean that I have to live through that trauma. And really, when I talk about critical mentoring, folks think I'm talking about young people. I'm talking about the mentors more than anyone, right? In order for us to do our work as mentors, as adults, as elders, as seasoned folks, whatever sort of terminology you want to give to us, we need to do the work of unpacking and healing for ourselves so that we can be who young people really need us to be in this moment. And what they need us to be, what they really need us to be, is loving, is caring, is supportive, is to push them in positive ways, is to affirm them in their true identities, is to acknowledge how harmful and violent these systems are and continue to be, to cushion some of that fall for them and that impact that they're experiencing. And I think most importantly, what they need for us is to not rest on our laurels, but to begin to act alongside them as they push us to be better, as they carry us into the future. That is what I think, for me, it really means to be a critical mentor and to show up in the ways that we need to show up. I tend to quote Angela Davis, who says, young people should be able to see further because they are standing on our shoulders. And for me, my role, the role that I've embraced as an elder in this work, is to think about how I can continue to strengthen my shoulders so that I can lift young people up, so that they can see beyond what I can see for today. If there's a legacy for me to have to leave behind, that should be my legacy, that my shoulders were strong enough to lift up the next generation so that they can have the ability to freedom dream, right? So that they have the ability to move us into the future that we know that we all desire and that we know that we all deserve, right? So we're thinking about critical mentoring. We're thinking about centering youth voices. We're thinking about powering and resourcing youth voices. We're thinking about being good partners and good co-conspirators. curating spaces where young people feel safe and loved and affirmed, right? Challenging institutions that would keep young people from doing the future work that they need to do. It's about loving ourselves, and it's about loving young people, right? And really this notion of radical freedom dreaming is particularly important because too often, and I think this has happened with generations right now, that too often we are so steeped in this fight. We are so steeped in the challenges. We are so steeped in this idea of survival that we forget that there's something beyond us, right? We forget to freedom dream. Again, we forget to use our radical imagination. And young people continue to push us to do that. And young people deserve better than what we've been offering them. Young people deserve mentors who are willing to have honest and courageous conversations with them. Young people deserve mentors who are willing to take a stand and to help them challenge these systems that we know are harmful for every single one of us. Young people deserve for us to be able to see far enough, right? To be able to clear enough of a path so that they can get to the next level, so that they can get to the next step, right? And so as I leave you with, these ideas around critical mentoring, I want to leave you with this sense of urgency around the work that we need to do as elders, around what's important in terms of listening and centering young people in their freedom dreams. And I know I'm looking at my timer because I always set a timer because once I start preaching, y'all, I tend to not stop. But I'll leave you with the words that young people deserve the best of us so that they can be better than us. Young people deserve the best of us so that they can be better than us. And with that, thank you. I appreciate it. I think that was somewhere around 23 minutes. I'm trying not to go over. And is happy to be in community, really happy to share space with young people and excited to continue this conversation.
Wow, that was so great. Thank you so much, Dr. Weiston-Serdan. We are going to be moving on to that intergenerational dialogue. And since your work is very youth-centric, we want to get some insight from our students that are part of the collaborative program. So we have some Rutgers Bonner leaders and some collaborative mentors. The Bonner program is a nationally recognized 4-year undergraduate civic engagement program that provides leadership, programming, academic support, and engagement opportunities. And the collaborative mentoring program since the fall of 2010 has supported, economically disadvantaged local youth here in New Brunswick through our partnering organizations like the New Brunswick Free Public Library, Middlesex Community College, PRAB, the New Brunswick School District, and we can go on. But we are going to have these students join us for this discussion, and they are Kevin, Ushma, Anthony, and Zanzita. I'm just going to give you a quick little bio about them. Kevin is a first-year student here at Rutgers, and he's in the School of Engineering. He intends to major in biomedical engineering, and he does work with Upward Bound, a pre-college program where he tutors students in various course subjects. We have Miss Ushma Patel. She's a super senior, and she's majoring in biological science. She's going to be graduating this May, but she is aspiring to be a dentist. We also have Anthony Mazakas. He is a junior majoring in social work, and he's interested in child welfare work and would eventually like to become a program coordinator director for an organization that's serving children. And Sanzita is a senior that's studying poli-sci at this here and on campus, and she works with several populations through the Rutgers Upward Bound program, New Student Orientation, Scarlet Ambassador, and she's also been a Rutgers Bonner leader. We are going to have these questions, and we are going to have another Bonner leader, Farida Labib Ali. She will be taking over. Farida? Is she not here? Oh, who's going to help me with those questions that are in the chat? Okay, so
We're gonna have the dialogue first, Karen. So I think Sanzita's leading that off.
Okay, so we are going to be moving on to those questions. Please throw your questions into the chat, everyone, so that we can cover those. But
And we're going to do the intergenerational
yeah, let's go ahead, students.
dialogue.
If we can start with Kelvin, you have a question. Let's start with yours, please.
Hello, everybody. As previously mentioned, I tutor for the Rutgers Upper Brown Pre-College program, a program aimed at helping high school students prepare for their college experience. And my question to you, Doctor, is, are there cases where critical mentoring isn't enough to help certain individuals? And how do we address these rare cases?
Thank you for that question. I mean, I think I got a more holistic vibe. So I don't think critical mentoring is ever enough, right? I think that it's a part of something much larger in terms of the movements that we need to continue to build, the ways that we need to push institutions, right? The abolitionist work that we need to do to sort of dismantle, but also build, what we think is possible. And so for me, I see critical mentoring as just like one piece of sort of all of these different things. But the reason why critical mentoring for me was particularly important was because we often sort of theorize around movements without centering youth voices again. And what we're kind of, and to be historical about this, like young people are often the very center of movements, like they move movements along, right? But we don't have we haven't had, I don't think, really intentional ways to cultivate the future of these movements, right? It's just sort of happened. And so for me, mentoring is a really intentional way to do that. And it's a way to continue those movements. And it's a part of the bigger piece, right? Or the bigger sort of puzzle that we need to put together to get free.
Thank you. We have Ushma Patel.
Hi, Doctor. That was a very, very powerful and impactful speech. Thank you for that. It was very eye-opening. So I am a mentor with the Collaborative Mentoring Center, and I tutor students at the New Brunswick Free Public Library, usually students from pre-K through 12 in math, science, and English. So it's a very, very eye-opening experience there too, just seeing all of the students who have so many adversities, but they come and they still want to fight for an education. So it's very, very important. My question is, how do we encourage or motivate young people to find their own voices?
Thank you. Again, these questions are awesome. For me, it has been about creating spaces where they can use their voices and practice using their voices as often as possible, right? And one of the things I noticed when I really started to do critical mentoring work myself is I would, of course, center youth voices by asking my protege, like, hey, what do you want this mentoring relationship to look like? How do you want me to show up as your mentor? What does mentoring look like for you? And young people would just kind of give me this look. And it wasn't necessarily that they didn't know the answer, but it was like they had never really been asked, right? They didn't have a lot of opportunities as young people to voice, this is how I want to be, right? In community with you. And so what I learned very early on is that I need to be really intentional about giving them, or I don't even like the word giving, but like I needed to be as intentional as possible about making sure they had ample opportunity to utilize their voice so that they could hear themselves, so that they felt confident, right? So that they just sort of practice over and over and over again, sort of commanding a space and like showing up and being courageous, right, in the way that they really wanted to. So I think when we're thinking about like curating mentoring spaces, we have to think that same thing. How often in this mentoring space can we make sure that young people are leading, young people are the ones speaking, young people are the ones facilitating, and just making sure that they have a lot of opportunities so that they gain more confidence in themselves and in their voice.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. We have another great question from Anthony.
Hi, Dr. Serdan. I really enjoyed hearing your
your talk, and I'm also excited to hear you answer more questions later. I'm Anthony. I have worked with Upward Bound, hopefully will continue, and I'm currently working within a New Brunswick middle school doing tutoring. And I was wondering, all of my mentoring so far has been online. So one of the things you talk about in your TED Talk is letting youth lead. So I was wondering how you can apply that specifically to online mentoring, since things are so much different in that format.
Thank you for that. And things are so much different in that format. And thank you. It helps me to sort of reiterate the point that we are all existing in this global pandemic and we have to give each other grace. So I just wanted to say that again in case we forgot. But I think in the online space, it's not that much different from the physical space, right? It's just about making sure that young folks have the power to really dictate what those meetings look like, and making sure that they have all the tools and the resources that they need to facilitate their own spaces, even if it is online. I know one of the things that young people said to us during the course of the pandemic, especially in the first year, was like, do less. People started thinking during the pandemic, people were like, why don't we just take everything that we were doing in person and do it online? And I don't think, especially in that first year, we really recognized how taxing that was and how overwhelming that was. And I think on some level still is. And so one of the lessons that young folks taught me about switching to virtual was we need to do less, be much more intentional, do fewer things, but do them in much more intentional ways, and just make sure that those spaces are powerful, rather than trying to transfer the same idea of like, oh, we meet once a week, so we're just going to meet once a week on Zoom, right? Things are a little more overwhelming now in the virtual space, and people expect more of us because of the flexibility that we have to get from meeting to meeting, and I have to commute and all these things. And so there's a lot of overwhelm attached to that. So, I mean, I think the same rules apply in terms of making sure that young folks have ownership of those spaces. But I think the added lesson there is just to be really intentional and to do less.
Thank you so much. And we have Zanzita.
Hi, thank you so much for that talk, Dr. Weiston-Serdan. I literally still have goosebumps, if you can see. But hello, everybody. My name is Sanzita. My pronouns are she, hers. I am a Bonner leader. So for the past just about 4 years now, I've worked with a lot of underserved communities in New Brunswick and Piscataway. And I also tutored students in the Upward Bound program. And in my experience as a mentor for predominantly first generation students of color, I've seen that a lot of my mentees are discouraged by how pervasive systemic racism and institutional biases are. You know, they go on TikTok, Twitter, they watch the TV and they see people that look like them being brutalized by the police, the law enforcement, what have you. And a lot of the times from the conversations that I've had with those students, they feel like they want to give up in a world that doesn't respect them now and might not respect them in the future. So my question for you is, how do we ensure that those students don't lose hope in such a time where it's so easy to do so? And, you know, the political climate is so devastating.
Thank you for that question. And my response is going to sound a little bit cheesy, but I truly believe what I'm about to say, and that's love. I really do believe that. I mean, I think so much of what we're seeing around us has to do with harm and violence and negativity. And I think especially for young folks with these marginalized identities, one of the best things that we can do is to sort of love ourselves to life, right? Just continue to affirm one another, continue to build spaces where we can heal, where we can process the harm that's been done. And that's why for me that component of critical mentoring that says, deal with these issues head on, right? Like, don't avoid them. Don't, focus, let's just focus on these grades, right? Like knowing that all of these things are going on. I think it's about processing that and taking opportunities to heal. I mean, a lot of the work that we've done with our young people in the last couple of years has been all around healing and wellness. Hiring therapists, BIPOC therapists, like making sure that they're in space as we process this, being really intentional about resourcing therapy for young folks because they may not be able to access it, but they need it. And so I think we have to center love, and I think we have to center healing.
Thank you so much.
That's really great. And I know we have more questions probably in the chat. So this is when Ms. Farida is going to take over.
Hi, good evening. My name is Farida. I am a Bonner leader. Amy introduced me to this really great opportunity, so I'm really glad to meet you guys. The first question we have in the chat is, how can mentors create a safe space for their multilingual or international mentees?
Thank you for that question. I did see that question, so thank you for that. Yeah, I mean, I think for me, the advice is universal, right? It really goes down to, or comes down to, how we create the spaces in the first place. Are we listening to the people that we say we're serving, right? So if you're looking to create spaces that target those particular youth, you should be working alongside those youth to create that space, right? You shouldn't be doing it and then bringing them in. You should be asking them, what does the ideal space look like? What kind of services would you need? Like, what would a program look like? One of the examples that I give is, we just launched some Black Girls Work 2 years ago. We call it our Black Girls Empower initiative. And we spent a year before we ever launched anything just talking to Black women and girls, just talking to them, just bringing them in and, having focus group sessions and asking them questions about what programs might look like, who they'd want to see head up the programs, how should they be facilitated, what should the priorities be, right? And so we didn't build anything and then say, okay, Black women and girls, come and see what we got for you, right? Like, we asked them first, what do you want? And then after that, the next step was to then work alongside them to build it. So then we specifically hired Black women and girls to facilitate this programming, right? So I think the same thing goes with those other types of mentoring programs, that we need to listen to the folks that we say we want to serve. We need to work alongside them so that they're fully engaged in their own programs and services. And I don't really think that there's another way we should be doing mentoring at all, but that's just, sort of specifically, I think that's what you do to set up the right kind of space.
That's really great to hear. Inclusion in the community can also make the people in the community to be like they feel included in it if you listen to them in a way. Another question we have is, what are some strategies to handle and encourage the language or cultural differences?
Again, this is going to sound funny too, but just like free, like being free. I think a lot of what happens, and folks sometimes get frustrated with me, like when I'm doing workshops or trainings and they're like, just give us strategies, like just tell us what to do, like give us a checklist. And I think a lot of what we do, especially when we're setting up programs for young people, is we overthink. We overprogram, right? Like, we have an answer for everything. We've decided the order of things, how the agenda is gonna go, like from minute to minute, right? Who's gonna say what, when they're gonna say it. And it doesn't allow for any freedom, right? And so then we have to kind of, as things happen, it's almost like we have to pivot, or we have to figure out, oh, how do I address this? When really in the first place, we really should just be in community with one another, and we should be building things just a little more organically, right? It doesn't mean that we can't plan, but we can't overthink things like how folks enter into the space. The best way to make sure that everyone feels safe entering the space is just to create a space where folks feel loved and affirmed, where we have community ground, understanding of how we're going to be in community with one another, right? And how we're going to support one another within these spaces. Because we tend to be in the mindset that we sort of have to police everything, then we're always sort of kind of looking to get ahead of problems, right? Instead of thinking the other way around, is just how can we just curate a really free liberatory space so that everyone feels safe. And then we don't have to worry about policing everything.
That's very interesting and very, I'd say very wise. Thank you very much. The next question is, someone asked about what does mentor self-care look like?
So I got kind of excited about that question. You know what? I'm in my bag on this mentoring self-care thing right now. Just radical rest, self-care, that is really important to me. You can't show up for someone else if you don't know how to show up for yourself. You can't be someone else's support if you're not whole yourself. And at some point during my talk, I said, a lot of my work with mentoring actually has nothing to do with young people. It's really a lot of talking to adults and telling adults to get their stuff together so that when they show up in spaces with young people, like they'll be better, right? And I think mentor self-care is in the same sort of arena, that we need to make sure that we understand what it means to take care of us, to love us, to affirm us. That's the only way you can model that and do that for young people, right? And it's going to be an ongoing practice. We're going to make mistakes. We're going to fail at it sometimes. But I think ultimately, all of the work that we're asking young people to do, it all starts with us, right? So it looks like sometimes not answering emails, right? It looks like taking a nap if you need a rest, right? It looks like saying no to things. People have a hard time with that, but it looks like saying no to stuff, right? And I'm actually talking to myself right now as well. It looks like taking breaks, it looks like, right now my dog is sitting there just across the room from me. And I'm like, it looks like taking time to just throw the ball with her for 5 or 10 minutes, because that gives both of us joy, right? So it looks like being really more intentional about doing that, so that when you do show up in front of a young person, you're a little more human, right? And you're a little more whole.
That is very wise. My dad actually told me that one time, that if you don't, because I'm always like caring and always friendly with everyone, but he's like, if you don't, care for yourself, how can you care for others? And now I'm kind of embarrassed to say that he was right. But
go tell dad that he was right and stop playing. Tell him thank you for the elder wisdom.
Definitely. Another question was why or how should we constantly challenge our underlying beliefs and assumptions about society?
That's another one that's just ongoing work, isn't it? We have to educate ourselves and continue to educate ourselves. We have to know that on a daily basis, we will make mistakes and get it wrong. But I think for me, a lot of this question lies in the self-reflection, right? We're human, right? So we're going to make mistakes. And then we also have like an education system and media and a lot of sort of ideas that influence the way we think and the way, we perceive other folks. But I think too often we're afraid to be wrong. And I think that's a lot of, for me, that question really is about that regular self-reflection that we need to do to check ourselves, right? To question why we kind of went there in the first place, like what's impacting that kind of decision-making? Why did I look at this person like this? Why did I clutch my purse when this particular person, crossed my way? I mean, really doing that sort of regular self-reflecting on why are we thinking the way we're thinking, and why are we showing up in the way that we're showing up, is a really important piece. And again, I think, part of it is like embarrassment. Part of it is like people are just like kind of, they don't want to get caught being wrong, so to speak. But I think having that kind of humility to recognize that everyone makes mistakes, but it's going back to that reflective piece of like, okay, I made the mistake. How am I now accountable to my community or the folks that I've harmed? And how do I show up better next time? And you can't do that without reflection. You can't do that without a little bit of like, all right, I need to get myself together here, right? or allowing your community to call you in a way that helps us all move forward.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard. Like you said, we are all humans. We don't want to see fault in ourselves. So we try to like, oh, I'm the better person. But I feel catching yourself when you're in that state of mind is better. And so you can reflect on yourself. Very great. These are really great questions. The next question we have is from Kelvin Guzman. I'm sorry if I pronounced the last name wrong. He asks, what are disadvantages of the youth not being mentored critically, and how deeply does it impact our society's future? Or what are the advantages of the youth being mentored correctly?
Ooh, so that's a good question. And Kelvin, I hope we can have a little bit of a conversation about this since we're both on the panel. But, for me, one of the things that I was concerned about was that I was actually doing harm in my mentoring because I wasn't acknowledging the reality of how toxic context could be for young folks, especially those with marginalized identities. And there was actually some research that came out around this idea that because we teach young folks, especially young folks from marginalized identities, the concept of meritocracy, that there's this sort of cognitive dissonance that's taking place. Like they can see that there's not a meritocracy, but we keep telling them that there is, right? And on some level, the research was saying on some level, like young people just check out and they just divest because they're like, you're telling me that if I work hard, I can get to this point, but I'm clearly looking at like the cheating scandal documentary on Netflix. And I know for a fact that that's not true. And so why do you keep teaching that to me, right? And so for me, the point of critical mentoring came down to being honest, right? And like acknowledging to young people, like, yeah, like this stuff is wrong. This is like situations are bad, right? Like the systems that you have to navigate are harmful. Like, yeah, there's very real violence that you're experiencing. It doesn't mean that we give up, right? It doesn't mean that we stop, but it just means that for me, it was like, there was a sense of, I don't know if the right word is peace, but there was a sense of, maybe the right word is peace, a peace of just like saying, you're right? You're not saying things wrong, right? There's nothing wrong with you. And I felt like the harm that I was doing was by saying to young people, like, you're the one who needs to get fixed, not the world. And that was like a terrible thing. And so for me, really the advantage of critical mentoring is about being honest about that, like really making sure that truth is at the forefront, and then working together in love and in community to figure out what we can do for ourselves and for changing what's happening around us. And Kelvin, I wanted to ask you, and I hope this is okay. I know like folks are asking me questions, but since we're like in this intergenerational vibe, I wanted to ask you, Kelvin, a little bit about your mentoring experiences, because you asked me this question about, what is mentoring the right way? And so I want you to tell me, from your experiences, did you have a good mentoring experience? What did that look like? And how has that impacted like how you're showing up today for the young people you're serving?
Well, I think it goes back to the conversation of adultism that you mentioned, that it's important to acknowledge their perspective as well. And just because you're in a higher position or you're older, it doesn't always mean that you're right. But I feel that has helped me, like acknowledging that their perspective is valid as well, has helped me in my mentoring experience. And I feel that once you open up to the students about your own experiences or being more open to receive their experiences, I think that allows your mentoring experience to progress better. And yeah, I think it's like you said about cognitive dissonance, that we sometimes ignore the truth, but we may not be able to recognize that truth if we're not open to the perspective of the younger folks.
Thank you for
great.
that.
Yeah, I know Sanzita's got a really great question. So maybe she can go ahead.
Before you coming here, I took it upon myself to read some parts of your book, which was absolutely lovely. I love the one analogy that you made of, cleansing the air and purifying the water in the context of students. And, at one point in your book, you mentioned how oftentimes a lot of mentoring programs, they're not doing it right. A lot of the times they'll inadvertently lead students to embody a lot of white values and, instill a lot of these middle class white archetypes. And I love that you use the phrase that mentors sometimes will help young people adapt to toxic water and polluted air. And I think that whiteness and middle classness has sort of become synonymous with privilege and safety, because we're not seeing like mass amounts of white people getting shot by the police. It's only people of color mostly. So I think for a lot of young students, seeing that, assimilating to whiteness, whether subconscious or unconscious, is compelling. Just vibing with being white just seems like the safest route to go. And so I think, I'm curious, how do we empower students to feel comfortable in their own context and reject all of these racial impositions, or, how do we dismantle internalized racism?
Thank you. And for all of those points, you dropped gems right there. So for me, I don't want to keep saying love, but I know love is going to be in this response as well. But it was really about like not reinforcing this meta narrative, the same stories that young people hear, which is this concept of like, pull yourself up by your bootstraps and work really hard and like move out of the hood and go live in the suburbs, or like sort of all of this quote unquote American dream rhetoric that really, like you said, equates to the more proximity you have to whiteness, like the closer you are to whiteness, the better for you, the safer you'll be, right? Which we know is wrong. But we also know that in sort of continuing to push that same narrative, that we're also giving whiteness like a lot of credit that it doesn't deserve. Because there's tons of brilliance and innovation and work ethic and I could just keep going, right? In communities, in Black communities and communities of color and queer communities and communities where folks have had to navigate like in terms of disabilities, right? Like we know that there's thriving there. I think about, and I'll try not to make this too long, but I'm thinking about when my first experience when I traveled to Ghana, like maybe 3 years ago. And during the course, like we were there for 2 weeks, we were on a writing retreat, and I was there with 5 other Black women. So it was like a whole vibe. And we were visiting sites of racial trauma, like as part of our experience there. And as the more we sort of visited different sites and the more the story evolved, like I kept seeing so much power in me, right? Like the more I heard the story that enslaved or Africans were enslaved, like literally pulled out of their villages and their spaces, marched, across Ghana to the coast, had to survive that, had to survive being put in the dungeons on the coast, had to survive the Middle Passage, or, then getting through that, had to survive slavery. And I'm thinking the fact that I exist, that my grandmother, that her grandmother, like that my family exists and that we've been on this land and that we have managed to survive is dope AF. Like I came home from Ghana, couldn't nobody tell me nothing. Because the story of resilience was like, look at this level of not just survival, but look at like what you created in this country after enduring all of that. And so I think because we don't tell those stories enough, a lot of the stories we tell are just always rooted in so much trauma, and not that slavery was not traumatic, like absolutely it was, but the way that we spin the story is like, oh, these poor Africans and these powerful white people, and like they suffered, right? But there's like a way bigger story. And because we don't tell the stories of how these marginalized identities thrive in spite of racism, in spite of sexism, in spite of classism, like in spite of being ghettoized, in spite of like being pushed out of educational institutions, in spite of like not being given business loans, in spite of not being able to purchase property. And like we still showing up and we still dope and can't nobody tell us nothing. That's what young people need to hear.
That was
I know that was long, but that's where I'm at with that.
Thank you so much. And like everything you said was correct, but I feel like just hearing you speak about your experiences in and of itself, like that I think is enough to dismantle internalized racism. Like I think I'm going to take this recording and I'm going to send it to all my students, because I feel like when you hear somebody that is so eloquent, just so dope in general, like you just want to listen to them. And I think that like you are such an incredible role model. So like kudos to you. I love that.
Yeah, thank you. I got like a little emotional right now when you were, talking about your trip to Ghana. That's just so powerful. I know that our other students, Anthony has another question, or Ushma, if one of you would like to go.
I typed my question in the group chat before, but I can ask another one too.
Okay.
Yeah, so how does critical thinking help us to civically engage with our community?
Yeah, we gotta think. As an English teacher, that was one of the things that always frustrated me, was that like we talk about the majority of citizenry, and we're always kind of criticizing, their lack of ability to think, so to speak. But a lot of that comes from, the way that we ask young people to be passive during like the entire course of their education, right? Oh, listen to adults, write down notes from the lecture, regurgitate that back to me on the test, don't question authority, all of these different things. And then magically you're 18 years old, we're like, go vote for the president of the so-called free world. Even though you've had no voice like your whole life, right? And you haven't like been able to really interact and question and challenge, right? Because God forbid, like you offend an adult in authority. So, I mean, I think for me, critical thinking is like a really important component of this. It's not that we have to agree, but we definitely have to make sure that we instill in young folks the fact that critical thinking is important, and we have to teach them to question and weigh and challenge. I was thankful to be raised partially by my grandmother, who's a Black Panther. And from day one, like she told me, question everything. And I'm slipping into her colloquialisms, but she would say like, don't believe what white folks be telling you all the time. Like, ask questions, challenge them, right? Like from my grandmother, that's what she would say to me, and taught me very early on, like, don't be afraid to challenge something, and don't be afraid to be like, wait, why are we doing it like this? Or why do you think this is correct? Or, tell me more about that. And really empowered me, even as a young person, to know that my voice and my questions were important, right? And to always sort of like challenge what I was hearing. And she would also say like, believe, she would say, believe none of what you hear and only half of what you see, right? So like her idea was just always to like dig deeper, right? And I think that critical thinking is a really important component to ultimately getting free.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Let's see if any of our panelists have any other questions. Anthony?
Yeah, I had a bit of a more personal question, but the high school that I graduated from, I know a group of students somewhat recently formed a No Place for Hate club. And actually tonight they're having a Board of Education meeting at the school, and there's at least one person bringing dissent against that club. And you can kind of like assume what someone who would dissent against a No Place for Hate club might be thinking. So I was wondering like what your response to those people would be. Like, what would you say to someone who's trying to disband student initiatives to be inclusive?
I'll be honest, I don't know that there's too much I would say to them. I think a lot of what I would say would be directed to the young folks who are in the club, and would be focusing on affirming them and making sure that they build a safe space and that they understand, what it means to have to sort of navigate those kinds of folks. But one of the things that I'm feeling right now in this time and age that we're in is that, some folks, they don't want to learn. And so you have to work with the folks who do. Some people are calling that the movable middle. We got a lot of sort of terms for it, but I know for me, for my own sanity, and this is back to self-care and rest, for my own sanity, I am not engaging in conversations or arguments with folks who just want to believe what they want to believe. And I'd rather use my energy to build with folks who love me and to build with, with the folks who are going to imagine, what to do and are going to sort of be in the future with me, so to speak. And it doesn't mean that we shouldn't ever engage, but Anthony, I'm just giving you an honest answer based on sort of where we are in this moment in time and sort of how divisive things are. And I think one of the mistakes that we've made as folks who are like really engaged in these movements is that we keep thinking we can convince everyone to be on our side, right? And I think one of the lessons we need to learn is that like some folks, you got to get right or get left, so to speak, right? And so some folks are going to get left, and we have to decide where we use our energy. Do we use our energy and try to convince the folks that don't want to be convinced, or do I use my energy in loving myself and loving my community and getting us free?
I appreciate the honest answer. Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you. I also just want to say, because this is cracking me up in the chat, how Dr. Butler keeps saying things like currently questioning everything or currently not being told nothing. I'm totally going to use that. It's cracking me up.
Okay, so we've got some more questions from the chat.
Yes, Naitri Patel asked, the core of critical mentoring is placing youth at the center. How do you think that mentoring has evolved, especially in settings like schools, to incorporate this idea of youth-centered, norm-challenging mentoring? And do you see any improvements with critical mentoring over the years?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I have seen a lot of folks try to take critical mentoring on, and a lot of folks be, successful with that. I will be honest in saying that the places where it has thrived have not typically been in schools, because schools are too much centered on authority and discipline and punish and sort of these ideas that reinforce hierarchy. And maybe for some, I don't want to affirm everything that schools do, but I get sort of why, given the institution as it exists, why that needs to be. So people sort of feign being youth-centered in schools, but a lot of where I've seen critical mentoring thrive has been in community organizations and nonprofit organizations, where they really take the dive and they do the work of making sure that they center young people. They put young people on their board of directors. They employ young people. Young people are facilitating programs and events. Young people are really, they have voice, power, and choice within the organization. So I'm not saying that it's not possible in schools. I just think really the way that schools are set up, it's kind of always going to be a challenge. But I have seen it done really well in places. Kingmakers of Oakland is a space for Black men and boys that is just absolutely, I think, like an incredible critical mentoring space that I would highlight as someone who's really doing a group that's really doing the work. And I think folks have been talking more about equity in relationship to mentoring because of critical mentoring. I think they've been thinking more about what it means to move the needle and moving mentoring away from this top-down hierarchical process that's rooted in white supremacy and really trying to unpack that. So I do think that there have been improvements, but just to your point about like what it looks like in schools, I don't see it done as well in schools as I have sort of in other more community centers.
That's quite discouraging, I guess. We should definitely have this in schools, but you know, we learn each day, I guess. So Susan says that she's glad you brought up mistakes, but how do we earn back young people's trust when things go wrong?
Thank you. And I'm sorry for that movement. My dog was going to bark all through the rest of this if I didn't let her out. So yeah, you're right. Like, I think that's a really good question to ask, just about like, how do we earn back young people's trust? I think I'm writing about this right now. Actually, one of the things that I was thinking about is acknowledgement, right? Just actually acknowledging that we've been wrong. You know, I was thinking, and I was even talking to my mom about this, about the times in my childhood that she was so wrong, but just never even acknowledged it, just kind of moved on, because adults have the power to do that, right? And you just kind of have to sit with it. I think like one of the most important things we can do is just acknowledge, like, yeah, my bad, I messed up, I didn't consider that, like I didn't listen to you, right? I dismissed you. Owning that, you know, it's back to accountability, right? And being openly accountable, right? And it also goes back to this idea that you all named, is in terms of being in community. When you're in community with folks and you make mistakes, you acknowledge and you own up that you made a mistake, right? You're accountable for that, and then you figure out how to restore things, right? How to sort of fix the harm as best as you can. And so for me, when I think about trying to earn back young people's trust, I think about acknowledging first, right? Just saying, I'm sorry, I messed up, that was wrong. And I think it also then goes on to asking them how you can repair that harm. Saying to them, like, I know I've hurt you in this way, or I've dismissed you, or whatever the case is. How can I earn your trust again, right? Like, how can I be back in community with you? You know, what does it look like, you know, for us to get back to where we were? And then really sort of going with that process. And that's specifically for young people, but I also think that's just within our movements generally too, because right now there's just, you know, all this cancel culture, you know, sort of, it's one thing to be, you know, upset at cancel culture because you've been canceled. But I think it's another thing to really, really think critically about what it means, you know, for us to just, we're humans, right? Like, for us to acknowledge our humanity and acknowledge that folks are going to do harm and make mistakes. And how do we work on that and build and continue to build alongside each other? And I'm thinking very specifically about Adrienne Maree Brown's work on We Will Not Cancel Us, right? Like, we have to find ways to restore. We have to find ways, and as abolitionists who are thinking about what it means to sort of dismantle this concept of discipline and punishment, and then replace it with like things like restorative justice, you know, we have to spend more time figuring out, you know, what it means when people are messy humans, because we are. And so what do we do? You know, what does forgiveness look like? What does restoration look like? And I think that that's some of the work we need to do. But I think that starts with acknowledgement. I think accountability is a part of it. And I think, you know, directly asking the person that you've harmed, you know, what it looks like to be restored.
Yes, we're all human. I'll keep saying that to myself. And I hope you guys can, you know, just accountability, I guess. We're still learning. It's fine. Another question is from May Lin. She asked, how do you keep yourself from getting discouraged when your mentee is still having difficulties or not succeeding or not wanting to put in the effort?
I don't know that I get discouraged per se. I mean, I think sometimes it's just about where folks are. I've had to travel my own path, right? Do my own journey. I've made tons of mistakes. I know mentors have said things to me that I haven't paid any attention to, and some things that I did, right? And so I don't know that I get disappointed. I mean, I know it could be easy to get to that, but I think I just try to respect where people are in their own process and in their own development. And, one of the things I learned early on as a teacher was really the difference between being an authority figure and being a mentor, right? Because as a teacher, I kind of have the power and the authority to tell a young person, like, stop, you can't do that, right? Like, you can't go here, right? Or you can't behave in this way. But as a mentor who's engaged in a relationship with someone and who's in community with a young person, my role is less to tell them what to do and more to just be there on their journey alongside them, right? And so sometimes as a mentor, you see a young person, like, they're headed toward that wall, they're going to run into it. And you're like, hey, that wall is there, and you're running straight into it. And your job is not to, like, keep them from doing that, but your job is to be there, to be standing there after they hit that wall, right? It's just still be there with them. And like, hey, all right, like, I'm going to help you. I'm going to help pick you up. I'm going to help dust you off. What's next? I think we kind of have to have more of that mindset of just people being on their own journey and sort of in their own development.
Yeah, and I think acknowledgement comes in place here too, acknowledging if it's okay to feel discouraged, but you can also pick yourself up from there, and your mentor can also help with that. That's really good. Ludine asked, loving the conversation. That's good. The mentoring program she focuses on preparing undergraduate women for their transition in the workplace. How can we support these students to be the full selves and challenge systems when their jobs may be at risk?
Yeah, that's rough, because capitalism, the way capitalism is set up, I mean, I think, one of the ways that we've done it is it goes back to my point again about just having the conversation, right? Just having conversations about what it means, what it looks like. You're navigating these spaces, but also economic realities are a thing. And so it's about having a space where we can openly discuss, I'm having these challenges and this is what this looks like. I'm mad about this particular thing that's happening within the system. I'm willing to challenge it, or like, I got to live to fight another day because, this bill needs to get paid. Right. And I don't like fault folks, for not like always 100% showing up as an activist. Right. We all have this idea that, like, we all need to just like go in 100% all the time, right? And I think sometimes we just need a space to be like, I'm having trouble with this. This is a struggle. What are some strategies that you've used to get through this? Is this really worth, me risking my job? Or is this something that, like, maybe I need to just wait to see what happens, or maybe move on to another space? For me, it's more about having the conversation. And it goes back to that love and affirmation and encouraging them to be fully who they are, and also not taking any mess, but at the same time, like, just kind of walking that line. There really isn't a perfect answer to this question. And a lot of it for me has been just rooted in like having the conversation with folks and then letting them make their own decisions about what that is. Because I think we all make these sacrifices at some point in time or another, especially when it comes to like the capitalistic reality that, we got to live.
Makes sense. Thank you for the advice. Anna Branch says, Thank you so much for this conversation. And she noted critical mentoring is not happening in schools. So what is the responsibility of institutions to create space that enables critical mentoring?
Yeah, I mean, all the responsibilities, like schools needed to get it together. I try to, especially in this talk, like not talk too explicitly about schools, but as a person who, was a high school English teacher for over 15 years, I got mad beef with schools. I'm trying to cancel schools, no, but I just feel that, it's a really hard in sort of these massive systems to do things like that. I mean, I would start by saying, currently canceling schools, I love this. I would start by saying, teachers, because they have some sort of power within their classroom spaces, could really think about, centering young people's voices as much as possible, about making sure that they co-create curriculum with young people, things like that. I actually, even the physical space in my classroom was situated in a circle so that I would sit in the circle with the young people and not be standing up lecturing at them or down to them all the time. So even in my physical space, I try to create space that was more equitable so that we were all part of a learning community, rather than like me being centered and being the authority figure. So I think that there are ways that you could do it within schools. Ultimately for me, and again, because I really do believe in abolition, I do think schools ultimately should be abolished. I don't think that, or actually, I'm gonna stop what I was gonna say. I think schools do exactly what they're meant to do, which is why there's such a lack of equity, because they reproduce they reproduce sort of the capitalist, the racist, capitalist, patriarchal system that exists in larger society. So it's sort of a training ground for that. I was actually hoping that during that the pandemic would break schools, that during the pandemic, we would sort of divest and all find more community-centered, holistic spaces where we could educate our young folks and not really be depending on schools as much. So I was sad that that didn't happen, but I also, again, understand that the capitalist reasons why, all parents can't divest. But I think that that's another frontier. And I think that the pandemic is exposing a lot of those cracks, I think more so than ever. And I'm just hoping we figure out exactly what we need to do with schools.
Wow, we really covered a lot of questions today, and it's just been so great. I really want to thank you for your insight today, Dr. Weiston-Serdan. So as we bring this workshop now to a close, there will be a survey link in the chat. So if everyone that attended could please, just take a moment to provide some feedback on the presentation today, and tell us about any topics that you'd like to have covered for future, webinars, workshops. We hope that you can tell us maybe some takeaways that you got from this workshop, and we also hope that you can put some of these things into practice, right, in your life as you're out there as mentors. So I really want to thank everyone from DICE, the Division of Diversity, Inclusion, and Community Engagement. I want to thank Dr. Butler, the student mentors, everyone at the collaborative staff, and of course, I want to thank you for being a part of this event. So on behalf of Rutgers University and the Collaborative Center for Community Engaged Learning and Research, thank you for making time from your busy schedule, I know, to just join us, for this Access Week. I wish all of you a very nice evening. We do encourage you to check out the other events because this is only Tuesday. We have many more wonderful events during Access Week. So I want you guys to check them all out. So if you do have any additional questions, you can email the collaborative at civics@rutgers.edu.